The Odyssey is the hope that is on the other side. In order for the resurrection to happen, the crucifixion must happen first. There has to be a descent into the valley of the shadow of death. We don't want to go back into the past. We don't want to think about what came before, but we have to be willing to do that, because if we don't go into the past, we don't understand ourselves. Well, hey there, and welcome to the Golden Thread. Great to be with you today, and we are very, very excited about a particular movie that is coming very, very soon, and that is The Odyssey, being directed by Christopher Nolan. And, I am a huge Nolan nerd. I remember watching The Dark Knight for the first time, and up to that point, I hadn't really checked out Nolan particularly, and I had seen Batman Begins and really enjoyed it, but it was The Dark Knight that blew my mind. Once I had seen that movie, I was hooked, and then of course went back to all of his other films and had my mind blown by those as well. And I've followed him ever since, and I think Christopher Nolan, in a lot of ways, he is I think he's the greatest filmmaker of our generation. I think he's one of the greatest storytellers who is working today, particularly in film, but I think even just across media. And so it's really, really exciting to see Nolan tackle a story that is, so we have the greatest filmmaker of our time tackling one of the greatest stories of all time, and that is Homer's Odyssey. And we've spoken here on the channel a little bit already about Homer. We've talked about the Iliad, and so as we're going back and we're discussing some of the foundational stories, some of the stories that make us who we are, that helped us to establish a framework for Western civilization. When you think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, these are two of those stories that go way, way back into the distant past. And we've talked about how essentially they are, in essence, they are one story. The Iliad is one side of the coin and the Odyssey is the other. The Iliad, in a lot of ways, we've talked about how it is essentially about the falling apart. It is about falling down. It is about the fragmentation and deconstruction and fall of civilization. And essentially, it's about the reveal of all of the fragmentation that was already occurring between all of the different kings and all of the different leaders. And it's not just the fall of the Trojan civilization, but it's also really essentially exploring the fall of the Greek civilization, that something had been going wrong for who knows how long, and it was the Trojan War that revealed that inner conflict, that fragmentation that was already present in that culture. But it took that kind of conflict to begin to reveal that, and for that to become known. And so essentially that's what the Trojan War is. That's what the Iliad is it's about this kind of falling apart of civilization. And so it has a lot of bearing on our world today as we're beginning to see things falling apart. And it is the pattern of the world. It is the pattern of civilization and of human beings themselves, that we tend to fragment down. And so in a lot of ways, the Iliad is that story. And the Odyssey is the other side of it. The Odyssey is the hope that is on the other side, which is that as all things fall apart and all things fragment and crumble and go down to the bottom, that there is a return, that there is a rising up again, that there is a resurrection on the other side of the grave. But in order for that to happen, in order for the return home to take place, that there has to be a descent that happens first. We have to go down. In order for the resurrection to happen, the crucifixion must happen first. There has to be a descent into the valley of the shadow of death, that we have to go down into darkness, into chaos, into disintegration before the new life can come up again. The seed has to be planted in the ground in order for the new life to begin to grow. And so that is what we see happening in the story of the Odyssey, that essentially Odysseus, the story of the Odyssey, for those who are less familiar, takes place and revolves around this one particular character of Odysseus. And Odysseus is the king of Ithaca. And he leaves his home, he leaves Ithaca and goes off to fight in the Trojan War. And if you'll recall from our discussion about the Iliad, this is a war that was supposed to, be a one and done. It was supposed to be over just like that. It was going to be no problem. The Greeks would go, the armada would sail off, the army would come, they would crush those little upstarts, the Trojans, and then they'd be back home again in time for dinner, so to speak. But that's not what happens, right? We see that because the Greek civilization has become so fragmented, it has become so egotistical and broken that there is no unity, that the army, even this armada, even though they're all seemingly unified, that there's all this bickering and there's all this struggle in between all of the different leaders and behind the scenes. And for this reason, they can't win. They can't win against the Trojans. And so the war drags on and on and on and on for 10 years, like Vietnam, right? As we said, the Vietnam of the ancient world, essentially, where we just can't seem to find unity. And at the end of that story, at the end of the Iliad, what brings unity is actually Odysseus himself, that Odysseus is able to concoct this plan. We said that the way in which they find unity at the end is to unify against their common adversary, the Trojans, and to stop fighting one another. And so they unify against this common adversary, but it's Odysseus that concocts the ingenious plan, so deceptively simple, that ultimately destroys, that leads to the fall of the city and the victory of the Greeks. And that is, of course, the Trojan horse, that the Greeks hide themselves inside of this horse. They have to break apart the ships, right? They have to take apart their own individual kingdoms, you might say, and build them into this one thing, this one device, that they hide themselves inside of this hollow horse, and they leave it as if it were a gift, right? Beware Greeks bearing gifts. And the Trojans, really, it's funny that the Trojans, of course, take it and they bring it inside of the city. And I think it's kind of a sense here of believing what they want to believe. They want to believe that the war is over. They want to believe that that everything is safe. And so they do. They accept the gift. They bring it inside. And of course, once they do, they emerge. The Greeks that are hidden inside emerge out, and they open the city gates, and the city falls, and so forth. So the story picks up at the end of all that, where now Odysseus, who is sort of the hero, he's the hero of the day. He is this character who is very crafty. He is very smart. He's very cunning. And he's going to begin his journey home again, right? So he's going to return home, and he's trying to return home. And so once again, you would think that this would be a simple thing. Just get in the boat, get everybody on board, and sail back again. But that isn't the case. That his journey home actually ultimately takes another 10 years. This is not a short story, right? So there's 10 years of Trojan War, and then there's 10 years of the journey home. And the reason why it takes so long, the reason why it takes 10 years, is because Odysseus loses his way. And this happens over and over again. And it's very symbolic. There's a lot of layers of symbolism for it, because his journey home essentially is his journey. It is a descent. And that's what we want to focus on and talk about here today, is this idea of the hero's journey. And then in order to return home, in order to ascend, in order to build the world anew, in order to restore civilization and even restore himself, that the hero has to go down. The hero first has to be lost. He has to go into the wood. He has to go down into the valley. He even has to go down into the depths of death itself in order to rediscover himself, to make himself anew. Because the thing about Odysseus is that the Iliad is the story about the revelation of the coming to the realization of the fallenness and brokenness of ourselves, and the fallenness and brokenness of civilization and of society, and its inevitable collapse. And so Odysseus finds himself in that place. And so there are all of these questions about, like, who am I actually? Like, who am I really? Like, oh yeah, I'm the king of Ithaca, but am I? Like, do I deserve to be the king? Like, he's just been through 10 years of war. He's literally suffering from PTSD. And there's almost this question of, like, does he even want to go home? Right? Like, he does. Like, he's longing to go home. There's this longing in his heart to go home. And at home there we see his wife, Penelope, and his young son, Telemachus, and they're waiting for him, and there's all these kinds of things that are going on at home, and his kingdom has fallen into disrepair. We'll talk more about that in a later episode. But he wants to go home, but there's this thing of, like, yeah, but does he really? Like, what will happen when he gets home is, like, am I actually worthy to be king? Am I actually worthy to take up the crown again? Am I worthy to go back? And so these are the questions that are in sort of the background of the mind. And so for us too, like, as we're going through life, when we encounter conflict, when we encounter struggle, they reveal our own inadequacies. They reveal our own weaknesses and our inability to be king, right? Or queen. And so we have to then go down and ask ourselves the hard questions. And that's what Odysseus does. And so you could say, in a sense, that the whole trip back, the whole journey of the Odyssey is Odysseus descending down into the depths, going down into himself. And there comes a point in the story where he finds himself to be really, truly lost, and that is on the island of Calypso. And Calypso is this nymph who basically falls in love with Odysseus and then takes him to live with her on this island, and he remains there for 7 years. And so during this time, essentially what happens is he has more or less a midlife crisis, right? He leaves his family, he forsakes the quest, he forsakes his family and his kingdom and the journey and all of that, and he stays with Calypso there for these 7 years. And then there comes this point where he kind of, like, awakens from this state of forgetfulness, essentially. And there's this kind of moment in our lives as well when we descend into ourselves, when we have the courage to go down into ourselves and confront what is there. And there's, like, a waking up. There's a snapping out of it that happens. And there's this question as to what will we do with the information? What will we do with what we encounter when we descend into ourselves and we encounter our own inadequacies, when we encounter the ways in which we have wandered from the path, where we have fallen short? Will we be willing to take the steps necessary to rectify that, to change, to undergo transformation? It's kind of like that scene from The Matrix, right? Where the famous red pill, blue pill scene in the movie The Matrix, where Neo has to make this choice of, is he going to take the pill that will wake him up out of the dream, right? This dream state, this matrix state in which he's been living in sort of blissful ignorance, or will he take the pill that will restore him back into the matrix, that will take him and send him back in, even though he knows that it's not real? Sometimes the temptation just to go back to sleep is so strong because it enables us, it offers to us the possibility of this kind of blissful ignorance. And so for us, when we have the courage to descend into ourselves, part of that is encountering and dealing with and grappling with what it is that we encounter there. And will we be willing to awaken and to resume the quest? Or is it too hard for us to acknowledge our own inadequacies? And do we choose to go back to sleep? very soon we'll be talking about another story in another subsequent episode about the medieval poet Dante Alighieri. Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, and the way that story begins is where the protagonist, Dante, awakens in a dark wood. He says he awakens from a sleep midway along the journey of his life. This midlife crisis, he awakens to find himself in a dark wood, for he had wandered from the straight way. And it's that same kind of thing. Odysseus has lost himself, and so it's about regaining identity. And I think for all of us, we experience these kinds of moments in our lives time and time again in small ways, and then in sometimes deeper and even sometimes more traumatic ways. We're experiencing this as a culture here in the West. We are experiencing the descent into the underworld, the fragmentation down into chaos. And the question is, will we be able to discover our identity? Will we be able to discover a unity that can bring us back together again? And in order to get the answers to that, we have to be willing to go down. And this is what I want to talk about a little bit here today, because there's a fear of the descent, that the descent is a part of the hero's journey. And there's something scary about that, about going down into ourselves, about taking time. We live in a society right now, we live in a time in our lives where we distract ourselves. We are literally distracting ourselves to death. And we distract ourselves with all these things because why? We don't want to be alone with our thoughts. We don't want to sink down into ourselves. We don't want solitude and silence. We want chaos and voices and distractions and all these things, so we don't have to face the deep questions of who am I? What am I actually doing with my life? Why am I even here, in this place? And so so we have to have the courage to be willing to actually go down. And we see in this story, and so I think it's so fitting that Christopher Nolan is telling this story now, that we're hearing this story retold at this time, because this is where we are at as a culture. This is where we're at as a people. And we see in the story of Odysseus, so his whole journey is basically a descent. But there's a specific point in time early on, before he goes on the great quest, right? Before he goes to all of these different things and encounters all of these adversaries and adventures that he does, he first has to literally descend into the underworld. And that is one of the very first things that we see, is that Odysseus has to come face to face with his past. And we have to do that too. We have to be willing sometimes to descend into the past, to look back. We are living in a time in our culture where we have become very infatuated with the future. We are very future oriented. We're futurists. We want progress. We want the new thing, whatever's new, right? Whatever's hot, whatever's trending, whatever's the next thing. Like always scroll past. We got to see whatever's new. And we don't want to go back into the past. We don't want to think about what came before, but we have to be willing to do that, because if we don't go into the past, we don't understand ourselves. If we aren't willing to go back and talk to our ancestors, so to speak, we won't know who we are. If we aren't willing to look back, we'll never be able to see what actually is ahead, to have the kind of foresight to be able to make a plan for the future that doesn't involve total dissolution and destruction. So Odysseus, one of the very first things that he does is he drinks a potion. He basically drinks poison, essentially. He drinks this hallucinogenic sort of concoction, and he descends into the underworld. He goes to death's door. He almost dies. And in this encounter, he meets his ancestors. He meets his mother, who has died of grief because her son wasn't there. And so it's this confrontation for Odysseus with his own failure. He has to face the consequences of the mistakes that he has made, of the choices that he's made, whether they were mistakes or not. But there are actually consequences to these things. He faces the people that followed him to their deaths. He has to face the shades and the specters of his friends and his colleagues and his enemies and his adversaries and his rivals. And he has to encounter them and talk to them and be willing to do that and face the fear. And we need to be willing to do that as well. We need to be willing to, even in our own lives, and we can think about these points in time when we need to actually go back and talk to our past, that we need to actually go back and talk to those who came before us in order to understand where it is that we're going, that we need to take a moment and silence the voices and take stock of ourselves and our situation before we go on the quest. Whenever there's something new that's arising in our lives, we have to be willing to take that moment to consider where we came from, right? We'll look back at our journals, look back at the past, look into ourselves, gaze into the abyss. And I think that we need to do this collectively as a culture as well, that we need to follow the golden thread back into the past. That is something that we need to understand, that we have discovered that there are sort of cracks and flaws in the structure of what we are building. And if we aren't willing to go back, and we said that conflict a lot of times reveals those kinds of cracks and structures, then we see this sort of fragmenting and falling apart of our society. And when we see that, we need to be able to trace the cracks back to the foundation. When we discover that there are flaws in ourselves, which there always are, when we build our lives up to a point where we're starting to see things coming together and going really well, things begin to teeter, they become unstable, and we start to realize, there's actually things down at the ground level, there's things at the foundation that need to be shorn up and need to be repaired. So we have to be willing to go back and trace those things back to their source. And I think we need to do this as individually as people, but we also need to actually do this as a culture. And so I want to actually take a little bit of time in this episode and in a few subsequent episodes to trace back the story of where we are as a civilization, how we've kind of come to this place in time. And we talked about, when we were talking about sort of the many-headed monster, we talked a little bit about how what we are facing as a culture seems to be sort of this mixture of these two things that are very prevalent in the world. And the one is, on the philosophical side, is what we would call postmodernism. This idea that there are many competing narratives, but there's not one single unifying story. It's just all these different things, right? And everything is relative, and everything is subjective, and everything is chaos. And so we can't pick and choose just one. So we're constantly deconstructing. We're constantly taking things apart and questioning and doubting. And it's led to fragmentation. On the other hand, we also see technology. We see the rise of technology, AI, all of the different, the internet, all of the different kinds of things that also seem to be kind of pulling us in lots of different directions, because there's all of these voices and all of these screens and all of these different things telling us different narratives. And so these two things together seem to be sort of joining together, coming together to form this sort of perfect storm that we are experiencing as a civilization. And the question that I want to ask is, where do we see these things coming from? Like, what is the source of these things when we look at the technology and when we look at the rise of postmodernism? Like, can we trace those things back into the past? Can we descend back into the past and see where those things come from? And what kind of wisdom, what kind of things can we learn from that? And maybe how can we learn to find a way forward? Because in a lot of ways, I think that we are trying, like Odysseus, to essentially chart a course forward into the future. And it's sort of this, we'll talk more about this again, but later, but it's this course between these two potential things that could pull us apart, right? There's that one point of the story where Odysseus has to sail between the monster Scylla and Charybdis, the pit, and he has to sail right between the two. And we have to sail between these things, the technology on the one hand and the postmodernism on the other hand. And how do we chart a course through? Well, we have to follow the thread. We have to be able to follow the thread back into the past to be able to see where these things kind of came from and where they may have arisen from in the first place. And I think that when we follow it back, we can go back to sort of the technological and industrial and scientific revolutions that really gave birth to modernity. And we'll go back, further, but I want to first just in this episode just talk a little bit about the early part of the 20th century. And I want to talk about World War II and sort of the post World War world and how some of these things came about. That through the two world wars, we saw the rise of this kind of this rapid arms race of technology and industry, and so we saw a lot of major figures arising during this time. I think it's very interesting that and poetically fitting that the story that Christopher Nolan is telling now is the Odyssey, and the previous film that he made just previous to this one was Oppenheimer. Now, Oppenheimer was a story about J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is considered to be, is known to be like the father of the atomic bomb, essentially. That J. Robert Oppenheimer was one of these figures who was pushing technology and development and industry and science forward in this kind of rapid way, because we had to beat the Nazis, right? So it's like we've got to get the technology before they do. And so the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb, was led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, and if you haven't seen the film Oppenheimer, it's really powerful. It's really wonderful film as well. So I would encourage you to check that out. But Oppenheimer is such a fascinating figure because he's this really potent figure, and he's pushing technology and he is advancing it, and they're developing the atomic bomb. And like the first half of the story in the film is about that, about can we build the bomb? But then the second half of the story is, what have we done, right? Like, what have we built? Like, is this thing actually going to destroy us? And there's this fear that Oppenheimer has of like, oh no, what have we unleashed upon the world? Like, we've opened Pandora's box, and what is being unleashed upon the world? And it's very fascinating because we know from the story of Oppenheimer's life that he kind of spent his first half of his life building this project and being a part of this advancement. But then the second half was really spent in essentially trying to put the genie back into the bottle. Essentially, he spent much of his latter end of his life advocating against the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. That he essentially he was essentially attempting to unmake that thing that had been made, or at least to try to protect the world from it. Because at the end of the film, Oppenheimer, there's this really powerful image where he's like imagining what might happen, and he's imagining this nuclear fire spreading across the face of the earth, and it's spreading and it's spreading and it's spreading, and it might ultimately lead to the destruction of everything as we know it. And so there's that fear. And it's interesting as well that the story of Oppenheimer is the story of, essentially, it's the story of Prometheus. And I want to talk about that story as well, that the film Oppenheimer is based on a book, and the book about the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer is called Prometheus Unbound. And that's a reference to this myth of Prometheus. And the myth of Prometheus, in a lot of ways, is the story of the descent, just like the Odyssey is the story of the descent and then the return. The story of Prometheus has to do, and this is the connection with Oppenheimer, the story of Prometheus has to do with fire. That in the deep primordial past, mankind basically lived in darkness. That this was before technology had been discovered. There was no science, there was no technology, there was no industry, there was not even fire. And so people lived in the dark, they lived in the hidden caves, they were afraid to come out at night, they were preyed upon by predators and all these kinds of things. And so they lived constantly in fear and all of that. And the gods looked down on humanity, and they refused to do anything about it. They refused to give humanity the power to make fire. They withheld it from humanity. All except for one. There was one who looked down on humanity and had pity and compassion on people, and that was Prometheus. And so Prometheus goes secretly by night. He goes and he steals fire from the gods. He steals fire. He steals a coal from the altar of the gods, and he gives it to mankind. And then very soon thereafter, we start to see campfires being lit and torches being lit. And that is the beginning of technology. That is the beginning of civilization in a lot of ways, because it is fire that brings us together around the flames so that we can tell the story to one another. And so culture begins to grow, and society begins to grow. And so people start to not be afraid anymore. And so so it's this story of like the compassion of Prometheus. Well, the gods are not very happy about that, however. So what they do is they bring Prometheus to court and they put him on trial for defying the gods, essentially, and he's condemned to be bound forever to a mountain. And so they chain Prometheus to the side of a mountain, and Prometheus is constantly being pecked by vultures and crows who they very graphically, they peck out his liver and they eat his liver. And so they peck him apart. But the thing is, of course, he's immortal, right? Because he's divine. And so he can't die. And so he's just condemned forever to live in hell, essentially, to be bound to this mountain forever as a punishment for his compassion on humanity, until one day Hercules climbs the mountain, breaks the chains of Prometheus, and sets him free, which is also a very powerful and beautiful story. Maybe we'll visit that at some point. But the story of Prometheus basically is the story of science, that Prometheus has long been a figure who is identified with technology and with science and with progressive advancement of technology and so forth. And so he's sort of the patron saint of technology and of science. But there's a question that's raised in the story, which is fascinating, that Prometheus gives fire to mankind, and the gods don't want that to happen. But there's this kind of question, there's this sort of ambiguity in the story, which is the question of like, why don't the gods want to give fire to humanity? And there's two competing narratives. One is that the gods are cruel. The gods are cruel and power hungry and tyrannical, and they do not want humanity to raise itself up out of darkness. And so they want to keep humanity subservient. And so they refuse to give them fire because they're afraid that if they do, that humanity will become too powerful and will challenge them in their rule. So that's one narrative. The second narrative is maybe not. Maybe the reason why the gods refused to give fire to humanity is because they knew in their divine foresight, they knew what humanity would do with the fire. That they wouldn't just use it to tell stories around the flames or to cook their food or to bring light and warmth and joy, that they would use fire as a weapon, that they would use fire to destroy one another, that they would use it to burn down forests, to destroy the world around them, that they were essentially afraid that humanity would destroy itself. And so it was out of mercy and compassion that the gods denied fire to humanity. That's another story, right? But they're both contained within the same narrative, that it could be either. It could be both. And this is sort of the question that still lingers in the background of our minds, even in the world today, that we see sort of this conflict between science and religion, right? We see this conflict between, and it is also the political conflict oftentimes between progressive and conservative, that there's this idea of like wanting scientific advancement, but then also knowing that it is scientific advancement and technology that might actually bring about ruin. And this is the story of Oppenheimer, that he is Prometheus. He gives fire to humanity, and then he's like, oh no, what have I done? And this is, I think, the case for us as well. And so we see the beginnings of technology in the story of Prometheus. Now, there's another interesting figure in the film Oppenheimer. We also see another powerful scientific figure from the early part of the 20th century, and that is Albert Einstein, right? So we have Oppenheimer and we have Einstein, and Einstein also was one of these incredibly powerful figures in terms of the advancement of science in the early part of the 20th century, particularly with his his two theories of relativity, right? That Einstein is most famous for his theory of general relativity and his theory of special relativity, and all of the significance that has had on the on modern science, the development of physics, and so forth going forward into the future. And so Einstein has had a tremendous effect on science, and so is extremely well known for this. Much more so, I would say, than with Oppenheimer. But there's a similarity between these two figures, which I think is fascinating. which is that Oppenheimer had this fear that of giving fire to man through technology, that by unleashing nuclear power on the world, that it might destroy us, that it might spread like wildfire, as it did in the case of Prometheus. But there's, I think, a subtle way in which the ideas of Einstein have also spread in a similar way. And as we're thinking about the films and the stories of Christopher Nolan, another one that comes to mind is Inception, where this is a story essentially about dreams and about ideas and the subconscious and the ways in which the subconscious affect us and can shape the direction of our lives. It's about the power of an idea. And there's a part in the story where it's discovered that there's an idea that's been planted in the mind of one of the characters, and that idea has essentially that it's gone deep within that person, and it has changed the trajectory of that person's life. And I think that part of the descent, part of the going down into the self, is recognizing those ideas, the ideas that have come to shape who we are. And sometimes those ideas may actually be false. There may be ideas about ourselves or about the world in which we live that have shaped us that are not true, that they're not in keeping with reality, and we need to be willing to recognize those and to essentially reject them. But they can be deeply in there, right? They need to be actually replaced with a different idea. Or sometimes there can be ideas that are true ideas, but that even true ideas, sometimes that there can be unexpected results that flow out of those ideas. And it can be sort of this domino effect of those things going on to influence our lives in ways, even though the idea itself might be true, they can influence us in ways that we hadn't expected, and that we need to actually take that time to sort of recalibrate back again. And I think that that's something that we need to do individually, and it's also that we need to recognize culturally as well. And a lot of times we think of the threat of nuclear war, which has been a sort of looming shadow over much of the 20th century and remains today a source of fear. But I think a lot of times we don't necessarily consider the power of ideas as being just as powerful as actual weapons and actual technology. That the power of ideas can be just as powerful and just as dangerous and can spread like wildfire in the same way. And I think that what we see coming out of the theories of Einstein when it comes to relativity theory and this way of understanding the world. So we understand that this idea of relativity is that space and time are connected. Einstein's great, revelation was, I think, the interconnectivity of the world. That time and space are not separate from one another. That gravity, right, somehow can have an effect on the passage of time, and which we see, of course, as playing a major part in Christopher Nolan's film Interstellar, which is also another great one. But we see this idea of relativity that through that, and this idea of the advancement of this idea of space-time, that these things are fused together, that the universe is meshed together, that space and time are related to one another, that they are relative to one another, that time, which had always been seen as sort of this thing that it's just set in stone, it's just flowing forward, it's linear, it's solid, it's foundational, actually it's relative. And actually there are things that can happen that would actually warp the fabric of space-time, and that there are things that can change our experience of time. And these theories have been borne out. And so we began to discover that these things were actually true. They didn't seem intuitive. They didn't seem to necessarily be things that we would think would be the case, but they are. And what I want to offer I want to offer this as a thought here, that I think that essentially that through that the development of relativity theory on the one hand by Einstein and others, and that the development of technology as represented by Oppenheimer and others, that we are experiencing sort of the fallout, you might say, of both of these things in the world today. And that I think that the advancement of technology and the proliferation of the idea of relativity are things that have shaped the modern and now kind of the postmodern world. That because I think that this idea that things can be, that everything essentially is relative, right? That everything is subjective, that everything can be sort of influenced and pulled apart. That is an idea that has seeded itself in our minds. And I understand, of course, that Einstein is not like the only source of the postmodernist paradigm in the world today. It's just one example, but I want to think of this one example because I don't think it's necessarily been talked about enough, that there's somewhere in the back of our consciousness that understands that, like, if time is relative, like what else might be relative? Like maybe everything is. Maybe everything actually is contingent, and that we can't, like, what can we be sure of? Because time is one of those things that you think, well, if there's anything that we know is the case, it's like, it's what time it is, right? Like, we know that time just is what it is. And yet that foundation has been sort of buckled and sort of changed by some of these advances in modern science in the early part of the 20th century. And I think that it has contributed to where we are at now. That the part of the reason why we have all of these questions about, like, what is solid and what isn't, is actually goes back to some of these ideas that have been kind of scattered like seeds into the world. And so I think it's very interesting that, Oppenheimer was afraid of nuclear power spreading across the globe like wildfire. But I think, and I think that we have seen that happen to a certain degree, but we also have seen it in a more subtle way through the ideas of relativity, and that it is these two forces that go back. Now, I think we can go further back into the past. We can trace this thread even further back down through into the early scientific revolution, and we'll maybe talk about that further in further episodes. But and I think that what we need to understand is that Einstein wasn't wrong, like with this idea of relativity. That sometimes we think that the things that can contribute to the sort of pulling apart of our lives or the pulling apart of society and so forth, that, like, they have to be inherently bad. But I think that that's almost never the case. Like, we look at even like nuclear power. Like, nuclear power is wonderful. Like, it's incredible, right? Like, it's a beautiful thing, but it is also something that can destroy. Like, fire is a beautiful thing. What Prometheus gives to mankind is wonderful, but it also has the ability to destroy. And in the same way, I think that the ideas of relativity are true. Like, they've been borne out by science, and, like, we understand, like, at a certain level, like, we get it, right? Like, and the ideas of postmodernism are true. Like, ultimately, the idea that we do see ourselves inside of a story, that we do view the world through a story, and we view the world through our own subjective lenses, and, like, that is actually how we engage with the world. And so we shouldn't reject those things, right? Like, we can't put the genie back into the bottle. You can't unknow a thing that we know. You can't unmake the atomic bomb. Like, we can't do that. We need to recognize the fact that these things actually are true. And I think that the truest thing that Einstein understood was the connectedness of all things, that everything is connected. And see, this is the thing that we need to understand, is that when you pull on a thread in the fabric of the world, in the fabric of space-time, or in the fabric of the mind and the imagination, like, that thread attaches itself to everything else. Like, time, our understanding of time is connected to our understanding of identity. Our understanding of who I am through time, like how we understand the passage of time, determines how we will understand who we are as human beings, as people. Our understanding of space and material and the places in which we live have bearing on our understanding of values, of what matters to me, like what things factor into the story of my life that actually matter. And so Einstein understood that these things were all connected together, and he sort of pulled on a thread. And I think that we've been pulling on these threads, these threads of the fabric of reality. And what started to happen, though, is that everything has begun to come undone. And so the question is, how do we put it back together? Like when we experience in our own lives the falling apart of things, when we pull on a thread and things begin to fall apart, or you can think about it in some ways as like when kids grow up, they start to understand things about the world that they wish that they didn't, like have you ever been in a place in your life where just like there's stuff that you came to know that you just wished you could unknow, like you saw something you wish you could unsee? And like I think that that's where we're at as a culture, that's where we're at as a society. And the question is, what do you do with that? Like, what do you do once there's nuclear power in the world? What do you do once there's relativity in sort of the cultural mind? Like, you can't put those things back. You can't pull them in. You can't take fire back and give it back to the gods. Like we have it now. Like, what do we do with it? And I think that and I think to find the answer to this, we have to go further back into the past. I think we have to continue to follow the thread further back. We have to descend further. We have to go all the way down to the bottom, right? Not just halfway. We have to continue down all the way. And so we'll talk about that further. But I think one thing that we can understand, and one way that can help us with this, is to understand that both of these things are true, right? That multiplicity is the way the world is, that everything is bits and pieces. This is what Einstein understood, that it is all relative, that everything is unique and different, and postmodernism is true, right? This idea and ultimately that everybody has their own story, that we see the world through stories, that everything has to be understood in that way and can't be disconnected from that. But also, so we have all that on this side, but also on the other side, we also need to recognize that there needs to be a unity at the bottom, that there has to be something that we're pulling towards, that there has to be something that takes all of the chaos and all of the threads and pulls them together towards a unity. And you have to have both of those things. And I think that actually is one of the things that the story of the Odyssey teaches us, that one of the great trials that Odysseus has to go through, which I alluded to already, is the trial of Scylla and Charybdis, where Odysseus has to sail his ship through this narrow channel. He has to walk the razor's edge. He has to walk down the tightrope. He has to sail through this narrow channel, this narrow inlet between, on the one hand, a monster, and that is the many-headed monster that we've already talked about. That is Scylla, which is it is a hydra, right? It is this many-headed dragon. It is this many-headed thing that shoots out its heads and pulls people into its jaws. And then on the other side, there is a pit. There is a whirlpool that just goes down into blackness, and that is Charybdis. And what this is a metaphor for, what the symbolism of what this means is, it is a symbol for what we have to do in our lives, which is that we must somehow thread the needle, that we must somehow walk the path between multiplicity on one side and unity on the other. This is what Christ talks about when he says that the straight and narrow, you must follow this straight and narrow path, that we have to be able to go between these two things, that we have to hold these two things in tension, that there is sort of chaos on the one hand and there is order on the other. And if we shift too far to one or the other, the result is destruction. That if we start to veer, like we're living in a time now where the ship has kind of gone into Scylla, right? It has gone into the many-headedness, into the many-headed monster of postmodernism and chaos, and so there's all of these heads and it's tearing things apart and everything else. And I think what we're starting to see is the ship trying to turn itself away from that and going the other way. But we also have to watch out for the pit. There's a pit on the other side too, which is unity. That like we think unity is a good thing. Well, unity can be a good thing, but unity can also be death, right? Like unity, and we've talked about this elsewhere as well, but unity can be totalitarianism, right? Like ultimate unity pulls everything into itself. Like it pulls everything like a whirlpool into its jaws. There's one philosophy, there's one story, there's one state, there's one law, there's one ruler, right? There's one. Everything is one, and we pull everything into the one, and that's not good. Like that is not good for anybody, because we are many. We are many people. We all have our own stories. We don't need one kind of dogma, one ruler, one, all-consuming, one single eye, to use Tolkien's imagery. We don't need the one dark tower, right? Because that is what we see, happening, and I think we're seeing that arising out of the chaos of our culture now. We need to really watch out for that, because and the way in which we watch out for that is we have to go back down to the foundation as the tower starts to get taller and taller and taller and thinner as it gets pulled up towards unity. We have to be able to go back down. We have to be willing to humble ourselves and go back down to the bottom, go down to the foundation, and ask ourselves the hard questions of like, where do some of these patterns come from, and how do we fix some of the flaws that are down there at the bottom. And that is what that is it is walking that path that goes right between the two, that we can hold these two things in tension. So what I want to offer as a thought, and this isn't a fully realized thought, we will talk more about this in the future, but what I want to offer as a potential thought is that we need to be able to have the multiplicity and unity and tension with one another. We have to find ways of taking the chaos and pulling it into the one, but we have to be careful not to go too far in either direction. And I think a clue for us is what happens in the story of the Odyssey. Toward the end of the story, one of the things that's fascinating is that Odysseus, in a lot of ways, is so great. Like, the story is so deep because Odysseus in a lot of ways is the modern man. Like, that is what he is. Odysseus is the man of science. He is the man who has essentially been running from the gods because he trusts in himself. He is the man who has trusted in himself, in his own ingenuity, in his own cunning, in his own technology. He's the man of science, right? He is the self-made man. He is, and he has pursued and he has done everything according to his own ingenuity his whole life, and he's gone this whole voyage. But essentially, no matter what he does, like things just keep falling apart, and toward the end of the story, what he has to do is he has to talk to Poseidon. He has to face the god that he's been running from this whole time, and he has to essentially make peace with God. It's so fascinating. It's like that scene from Forrest Gump, where Lieutenant Dan, who's been running from God his whole life, he climbs the mast and he shakes his fist at the storm gods, right, at Poseidon, and he's like, "Come and get me!" And on the other side of the storm, he's like just floating in the water, and he makes peace. He finds peace with God. And in a lot of ways, like, that's where we're at as a culture. It's like, how do we have both? How do we have unity, right? How do we have the good that is at the top, the one, right? God, like, how do we have the divine, whatever that is? How do we have that, but also understand that things are relative and things are chaotic and things are interconnected and diverse and all of those kinds of things? Like, how do we marry heaven and earth together? Like, how do we find that tension? And I think that's what we're trying to do. Like, that's what we need to do. We've realized that sort of, on the one hand, the atheistic project of it's just all stuff, like, that's not working. But then the single unity on the other side of like, well, just pretend you don't know all that stuff and just, believe the dogma. It's like, that doesn't work, right? Like, you can't do that. So how do we find this sort of marriage between the two? How do we find the unity? And I think the end of the story of the Odyssey is the unity, that finally he finds peace between. He finds peace in himself, right? He accepts his identity. He returns home to become king again. But it requires that he has to descend first into the depths to get to know who he is. And also he has to come face to face with the divine. He has to face the gods that he's been running from his whole life. And so we'll park it there. But I would just want to encourage you to just check out the story again of the Odyssey. If you've not read it, maybe pick it up and give it a read. It's a really remarkable story. And I would consider, some of these questions when it comes to our own lives. Like, what are the things that keep us from making the descent? What are the things that we're afraid of that we'll find at the bottom if we go down inside of ourselves? What are some of the ways in which the past has shaped us as a people? That the ideas that maybe were planted in us when we were growing up have spread and in some ways defined ourselves, that the technology that we grow up using, that in a lot of ways becomes a part of the world in which we live. How are those things shaping us, and how can we actually go back to the foundation and where we find that there are maybe ideas that have become destructive or things that have become unhelpful to us? How can we remake those things? How can we begin to rebuild stuff even down at the bottom of our own lives? And keeping in mind as well that when it comes to this whole civilization question, this whole society question, like, the world is people. Like, we are the world. And that's why it's one man at the end of the story of the Odyssey. It's one man, because everything back goes funneled back down to me and to you. That, like, if I can remake myself, if I'm willing to go down into the depths and change some of the things that are foundational at the bottom, that are making the structure rickety and falling apart, if I'm willing to do that, like, that's how we begin to change as a culture. That's how we begin to change as a people. Like, to find peace in the world is to find peace within ourselves. And so that's something that we can think about, and you can chew on that one a little bit. I would also encourage you, go out and see the Odyssey. Let's go see Christopher Nolan's latest masterpiece out in the cinema on July 17th, 2026. Or if that movie's already out and you have it available, go watch it again, and we'll have some more discussion of that together very, very soon. So have a great time. Enjoy the movie. Enjoy the book. And I will see you again in the next episode.